Welcome back to Planet Earth, our loving home, on Supreme Master Television. We are listening to portions of a lecture entitled Global Warming, the Impact of Meat Production and Consumption on Climate Change, given by Dr. Rajendra Pachauri, head of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in London, England. The talk was presented at a conference on the environmental effects of livestock raising, sponsored by the UK non-profit group Compassion in World Farming.
This gives you a picture of the way emissions have grown since the 1970s. And of course, it's obvious that the largest source of increase has been from CO2 emissions based on the use of fossil fuels. There is, of course, also an increase in other sources of carbon dioxide like deforestation, which is quite considerable, decay of organic matter and peat and so on. And then you have other gases like methane and N2O from agriculture and others. Now, if one wants to get into further detail on how much of these emissions are accounted for from production of meat, then we would really have to look at some numbers that I'd like to place before you. Unfortunately, the growth in global daily availability of calories per capita has not resolved food insecurity and malnutrition in poor countries, and in fact has increased pressure on the environment. Now, in recent months, as you're aware, there's been a substantial increase in food prices, and for some countries and societies where almost 80 to 90% of the household income goes for buying food, this really spells disaster. And as a result, we've had demonstrations, we've had protests in several parts of the world. But what is particularly sad is the fact that decades of effort to wipe out poverty have really been washed out by what has happened in recent months. So it's important for us to understand the inequitable and unequal nature of distribution of food, even though in the aggregate the world is now consuming a huge quantity of calories, both in per capita as well as aggregate terms. Its distribution leaves much to be desired. And during the last 4 decades, agricultural land gained almost 500 million hectares from forests and other land uses. Recently, I was in Brazil about 2 months ago, and I was invited to speak at the Senate over there. And Madame Marina Silva, who used to be the Minister of the Environment, and other senators told me that they're really concerned about the rate at which deforestation of the Amazon region took place last year. It seems to be increasing year after year. So, I mean, what we have to worry about is clearing of forest land for agriculture and related purposes. An additional 500 million hectares is projected to be converted into agriculture in the period up to 2020, mostly in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. If we look at accounting of emissions from agriculture, basically from livestock production, we have 80% of the emissions, total emissions from agriculture being accounted for by livestock production. It amounts to 18% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which is shown over here. And I'm using data that's been provided by the FAO. Since people found out about this talk that I was going to give here today, I've received a number of emails from people that I respect saying that the 18% figure is an underestimate. It's a low estimate, and in actual fact, it's much higher. If we look at the proportion of greenhouse gas emissions from different parts of livestock production, a good part comes from deforestation and desertification, about 35.4%. Then the manure, both direct and indirect, because do remember that a large part of food grain production goes into feeding animals that are essentially used for meat. And there's enteric fermentation, which is also quite large, 25%, and other sources, all of which is shown over here in broad terms. Now, producing 1 kilogram of beef, I believe, leads to emissions of greenhouse gases with a warming potential equivalent to 36.4 kilograms of CO2. It releases fertilizing compounds equivalent to 340 grams of sulfur dioxide and 59 grams of phosphate. It consumes 169 megajoules of energy, and 1 kilogram of beef is responsible for the equivalent of the amount of CO2 emitted by the average European driver per car for every 250 kilometers. And it burns enough energy to light a 100-watt bulb for 20 days. Now, again, let's look at the inequity of the situation, and I'll say a little more about this later. There are 1.6 billion people in this world who don't have access to electricity and have never possessed a single light bulb in their homes. And that, to me, is a huge tragedy, placed as we are in the 21st century. So I'm not saying that a reduction in emissions over here will translate into lighting of the homes of people who don't have electricity today, but it just brings out the stark contrast between the situation in prosperous societies and those that are really deprived.
Thank you for being with us today on Planet Earth, our loving home. Please tune in again next week for part 2 of our program featuring Dr. Pachauri's talk on the major role of livestock raising in producing climate change. Up next is enlightening entertainment after noteworthy news, so please stay tuned. We wish you and all other beings on the planet a very happy Earth Day 2009.
For more details, please visit www.suprememastertv.com/PE.